All right. Welcome, everyone, to our Shabbat on Wednesday program. It's so nice to see all of you, and a very special welcome to Rabbi Weinberg. Thank you so much for joining us. I feel like Rabbi Weinberg, particularly in this setting, is someone who doesn't need much introduction. But for the last 5 years, Rabbi Weinberg has been the rabbi of KMS Synagogue, playing a critical role not just in the Kent Mill Synagogue community, but across the entire greater Washington area. Currently serves as the secretary of the VAD Har Eva for Greater Washington. Of course, before that, we know most importantly, Rabbi Weinberg was the rabbi here, and him and Alana did so much for our community, and we continue to build on their wonderful foundation. Rabbi Weinberg is a sought-after speaker. We've been trying to get him to come back for Shabbos for probably about 5 years. And I guess one of the silver linings of Corona is that we're able to welcome back for Shabbat on Wednesday without having him to take a Shabbat off and fly all the way here. So I'm so grateful for him for joining us tonight, especially during this very busy time as the holidays quickly approach. With that, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Rabbi Weinberg and invite him to share tonight's address.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Brander, for inviting me to speak tonight. I've really been following, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, all of what you and the shul have been doing during this crazy pandemic. And it is really most impressive. I follow a lot of shuls, and you're doing a fantastic job keeping some sense of normalcy during this very challenging time. I only wish I could be there to participate in your Kiddush Roadshow. It looks like so much fun. Most people around the country have canceled their Kiddushes, but you still have a Kiddush. It says a lot about the shul. But seriously, a huge yesher koach for all that you're doing. The world has suddenly become so small in this Zoom era that I feel like in some way we're all together in one space right now, and it feels so nice to be together. It feels like a small piece of home, and I really appreciate that. It's a pleasure to see all of you, and really we all miss you, and I hope that you're doing okay during this time. I'd like to just share a brief idea with you in anticipation of this coming Shabbos. In our Parsha of Kisavo, Moshe Rabbeinu foreshadows for Bnei Israel a critical moment in the near future that they would face, a moment of great excitement and anticipation, a moment they've been waiting for 40 years, a moment that they would surely remember, a moment of great transition and change, the moment when they would finally cross over the Yarden into the land of Israel, the land that Hashem had promised them, the land that they had been waiting for, the land that they had been traveling to. And Moshe Rabbeinu tells them in great detail exactly what they're supposed to do the moment they arrive, the moment they transition and come in. Vaya b'yom asher tavru es hayarden, on the day, the very day that you cross over the Yarden, el ha'aretz asher Hashem lokecha nosein lach, on the day that you cross over the Yarden into the land that Hashem had promised you, va'kemosa lecha havanim gedolos, take huge stones, big stones, v'sadatah osam basid, cover them over with plaster, v'chasafta alehem es kol divrei haTorah hazos be'avrecha, and write down all the words of the Torah on those big stones that you're going to place there on the very first day of your arrival. He tells them that on that day when they cross the Yarden, the first thing they have to do in their new land is travel to this place called Har Eva and take massive rocks, plaster them over, write the words of the Torah, and engage in this whole ceremony of the blessings and the curses, the brachos and the klelos, reconfirming their commitment to the Torah and to the covenant that they had made with Hashem. And then, according to Chazal, go right back and return to Gilgal, the encampment, the place where they were encamping as they cross over the Yarden. What a beautiful, symbolic, moving, momentous ceremony, a perfect ceremony in every way. It's a ceremony that shows the commitment of the Jewish people to Am Yisrael and Torat Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, the great triumvirate that they had envisioned for so long and were now able to fulfill, bringing together Torah and nationhood and the land of Israel. It was a ceremony that set the tone for the rest of life in the land of Israel and the way it would be, the way they hoped it would be. Al Pi Torat Yisrael, according to the Torah of Israel, they were emblazoning upon these stones at their entryway into the land. It was a ceremony that marked the transition. It marked the threshold, the crossing over from one domain to another, from miraculous life of the desert to the normal life of Eretz Yisrael. You know, actually some Mefarshim note very beautifully that just like when we transition through the doorway into our homes, we transition from outside to inside. What do we pass on the way in? We pass the mezuzah, a place where the words of Torah are etched, so that as we transition into our space, into our home, we have the words of Torah on our mouth, we have the words of Torah on our hand. They say that's exactly what Bnei Yisrael were doing here, but not for one room or one home. They were doing it for all of Eretz Yisrael. As they came into the land, that gateway, that entryway, that threshold had to have the words of Torah etched in it. They could almost kiss that mezuzah upon entering their home of Eretz Yisrael. A very beautiful image. Feels like such an appropriate ritual, such an appropriate ceremony for this very liminal moment. The question is, why did it have to take place at Har Eva, of all places? Har Eva. Do you even know where Har Eva is? You don't have to answer that question. Har Eva is near Shechem. We know that because a couple of weeks ago we read in Parshas Re'eh that the Torah, as it describes this ceremony of the brachos and the klalos, Har Grizim, Har Eva, it says Har Eva was Eitzel Elonei Moreh. And we know from Parshas Lech Lecha that Elonei Moreh is right next to Shechem, which is approximately where Shechem is today. That means that Har Eva is about something like 50 miles from Gilgal, where the Jewish people crossed over the Yarden, where they had their camp. Now, why would a Kadosh Baruch Hu require all of Bnei Yisrael to travel 50 miles on their first day in the new land into the heart of enemy territory, into the difficult mountain range of the Shomron? What was so special about Har Eva and Shechem? Why couldn't they take rocks from the Yarden and put them right there in Gilgal, make the stones with the Torah? Why did they have to travel to Har Eva, to Shechem? Rav Zalman Siratzkin in his Sefer Oznaim LaTorah explains that they had to go to Har Eva and Shechem on that day, simply because all those who came into the land before them did exactly that. When Avram Avinu leaves Haran, comes into the land of Israel, in Parshas Lech Lecha, the Torah tells us, Vayavor Avram ba'aretz ad mekom Shechem. He came to Shechem and he built a mizbeach for Hashem. When Yaakov comes back into the land, he re-enters after 20 plus years in Lavan's home. The Torah tells us in Parshas Vayishlach, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem. He came to Shechem and he built a mizbeach. So says the Oznaim LaTorah. Ratza Kadosh Baruch Hu, Shegam Bnei Banav Haholchim Bidracha, Kesheyavo El Haaretz Hamuvtachas, Yelchu Ba'osa Haderach, V'shetereshis Darkam L'Shechem. So too, as the descendants of Avram and Yaakov enter the land for their first time on that momentous day after 40 years of wandering, they had to go to Shechem as well, because that's what their ancestors did. The lessons and the implications of this ceremony and this travel to Shechem or Har Eva are powerful ones for us. As much as what Bnei Yisrael were doing in that moment was new and fresh and uncharted and about future-oriented thoughts, it had to be anchored in the past and connected to those who came before them. What Hashem was reinforcing to them and to us is that all of us are a link in a chain, rooted in our past, holding on to parts of our past, informed and guided by our past, but simultaneously reaching out for a new and different future, reaching out to create a future that is uniquely our own. We, like Bnei Yisrael, way back in Shechem, are always, actually, standing at a crossroads, at a moment of transition as the bridge between past and future. As Rabbi Sachs so eloquently says in the introduction to his book, A Letter and a Scroll, he says, we did not come from nowhere, nor does our story end with us. We are leaves on an ancient tree, chapters in a long and still being written story, a letter in the scroll of the book of the people of the book. What's true of us nationally, I think, is also true of us on an individual level as well. And it's perhaps even more true at this time of the year leading up to Rosh Hashanah than any other time. Being engaged in the process of tshuva and introspection that so characterizes this month of Elul forces us to face our own moment of transition between our past and future, our individual pasts and futures. As we contemplate change and self-improvement, we are literally at the fulcrum, at the crossroads, at the transition point between our past selves, our selves of the year that just gone by, and our future selves, the selves of the year to come that we aspire to be. And we too must answer the question of how to bridge these two personas, these two personalities? How do we integrate our past selves and our future selves, our actual selves and our aspirational self? How do we navigate the transition between the people we once were and the people that we hope to be? How do we manage that moment of transition? Do we cling to the past or do we cling to the future? In his book, Leadership on the Line, Ron Chaifetz, who in the book is speaking more about leadership in businesses, but I think it's applicable to every one of us, says that actually what makes change in general so hard, what makes change so scary and dangerous is exactly this question about past self and future self that we either consciously or subconsciously think about. It gnaws at us, whether we know it or not. At some level, whenever we contemplate change, we feel a certain sense of betrayal of our former self, betrayal of our identity. We feel in some ways a little bit like an imposter, or like we're being disloyal to our former selves, or like we're calling into question everything we did in the history of our lives. That is really hard. That's hard. So hard that it sometimes causes us to give up and just stop before ever making any of those meaningful changes, because it's just too difficult a moment to be in. That transition tugs at us. We don't quite know where to go. We're pulled forward. We want to be someone else, but we don't want to betray who we were in the past. We don't want to abandon who we were in the past. We don't want to feel guilty for the people we were in the past. And if we change, we move on to something new, it casts aspersions on everything that was before. We're caught in this liminal moment, which is very hard to manage. And while I don't have any brilliant answers about how to make that question go away or how to change that challenging feeling that we might have in that moment, I don't have any silver bullets or magic solutions. This is an age-old problem that's never going to go away. But I do feel like the story of Har Eva in our Parsha does provide us with a critical perspective on that question that might at least ease the tension a little bit and make it slightly more manageable. Hashem's insistence that as Bnei Israel craft their new life, they first stop in Shechem, teaches us that as we contemplate change, we don't need to, and in fact shouldn't, try to forget our past, or ignore our past, or be ashamed by our past, or pretend like our past doesn't exist, but rather quite the opposite. We should embrace our past. We should hold on to it, even as we transition to a new future, even as we cross over the threshold to a new land and a new dream and a new vision and a future that awaits us. We got to go back to where our ancestors came from. We have to go back to Shechem. The story teaches us that if all we have is our past selves, then we never grow and we never change and we never improve. But if all we have is our future selves and we let go of our past, we forget our past, that in a very unhealthy way, we block and deny a piece of our identity that was formed in the past and essentially live a life that is filled with falsehood. It's not true. Live a life that doesn't have the necessary foundation upon which to rest, the necessary chain to hold on to, causing that future to just be floating in midair, to be as flimsy and ephemeral as a leaf, floating away in the wind that comes and goes and is never sustained. It's not anchored to anything. It's not rooted in anything. Both our past selves, even if they're flawed, and our future selves, even if we haven't attained them yet, are critically necessary. The hybrid of both, the attachment of past and future, is critically important to our growth. We don't need to feel awkward or disloyal to our past as we change, because we aren't meant to leave it behind. We're meant to carry it along with us and keep it as a crucial piece of our identity. In fact, without the past behind us, we don't have the momentum. We don't have the force to keep us going and growing into the future. I'll end with a great line that I think fits into this message by the late Yitzhak Tebenkin, who was one of the founders of the kibbutz movement in Israel. In one of the international discussions about the 1948 partition plan, which was going to divide up the land of Israel between the Arabs and the Jews, Ben Gurion asked Yitzhak Tebenkin at the time what decision he should make on the matter. He, meaning Ben Gurion, he wanted to get the advice of Tebenkin. What should I do? Should I be for it? Should I be against it? Tebenkin wisely replied that he had to consult with people. He has to go ask for advice. So the next day, Tebenkin returned to Ben Gurion, And he told him, okay, I sought advice, and you shouldn't agree to the international suggestion to divide up the land. So Ben Gurion asked Tebenkin who he consulted with. And Tebenkin famously replied. He said, I consulted with my grandfather, who's dead, and with my grandson, who is not yet born. What a beautiful image to think about. As we contemplate meaningful changes for ourselves in the days that come, we should consult with our former selves and our future selves and bridge the gap between them. And by doing so, see, Emirz Hashem, so much success at navigating our changes so that we can chart out a beautiful future that will await us in the coming year. It's really a pleasure to see all of you tonight, and Alana and I with Joseph and Riva and Adi and Avishai, who many of you never even met, and our parents on both sides, wish all of you really a Shana Tova, year filled with so much health and happiness and success and safety and the passing of all this corona. We really can't wait to visit with you and to see you again very soon. Rabbi Brander, thank you again so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Rabbi Weinberg. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Weinberg.
Thank you.
Very
Thank you very much.
great to see all of you.
Wonderful seeing you.
Thank you, Rabbi Weinberg.
Thank you so much.
Very welcome. My pleasure. Have a great Shabbos, everyone. To stay safe.
Good year.
Shana Tova to all of you.
Amen. Shana Tova.
And
Thank you, Rabbi
happy
Weinberg.
belated birthday, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Should be a good, healthy year.
Amen. To all of you.
Great to see you.
Tell me something new. Tell me something new aside from Corona in West Hartford.
Lots of girl babies.
Lots of girl babies.
That is wonderful. Should keep it coming.
Yeah.
Guards, please, Alana.
Well.